Pray with me, please. And now, God, with hearts that have been primed with worship, we come to your word. And we desire to see marvelous things. We desire to see the greatness of who you are, to have our vision of who you are renewed and expanded and deepened and widened. And so we ask, give us eyes to see, ears to hear. Allow your Spirit to illumine your word through the preaching of it this morning. We ask in Christ's name. Amen. Please turn in your copy of the Scriptures, please, to the book of Genesis, chapter 21. Think with me, if you will, of the experience of what it is like to try to hold your breath for as long as you possibly can. As you go on, your face begins to turn a little bit red, your cheeks begin to puff out a little bit, your lungs start to hurt, they start to burn, your eyes begin to water, and then as time goes on, your feet start to shuffle, your hands start to fidget, your body's just rocking. You're trying to hold your breath, but you just want to breathe in the worst possible way, and your body is screaming at you, I need air. Your whole body eventually gets tense and rigid, and the dominating thought in your mind is that desperate need for oxygen. It's hard to focus on anything else. Getting air becomes the consuming thought. We've been, I think, over these last 8 or 9 chapters or so of the book of Genesis, essentially been holding our breath, waiting for the outcome of a promise that God made all the way back in Genesis chapter 12 to Abraham and to Sarah. That they would become parents of a family that would grow into this great nation. And the remaining series of events that have transpired now over 8 or 9 chapters have effectively been a breathless anticipation for the birth of this promised son to Abraham and Sarah. Not only have we, so to speak, been holding our breath in this text, waiting when is this child to come, but certainly Abraham and Sarah have been waiting and holding their breath. And the longer the wait has gone on, the harder it has been for them. We've seen them at times squirm and falter a little bit in this period of waiting. In fact, this stretch of waiting has now extended, going on 2.5 decades. So this has been quite a long time to hold one's breath. But this morning, at long last, we get to take that deep breath of air that we've been waiting for, because at long last, the much anticipated child comes in this text. Now, there's a lot that's going to be going on in Genesis chapter 21. There are a lot of characters in this text. There's Abraham, there's Sarah, there's Ishmael, there's Hagar. We get to meet Isaac. We're also reacquainted with Abimelech and introduced to his military commander, a man named Phicol. And it's easy to get caught up in the birth of this special child that we've been waiting for, and the party that gets thrown, and then a subsequent banishment that happens, and a treaty that gets made, and the doings of all of these various people and the happenings of their various lives. It's easy to get caught up in all of those details, but I would submit to you that really this is a text that from start to finish is about God. It's about the God who from verse 1 comes to Sarah to keep his promise, and about the God who Abraham says at the end of the chapter is the everlasting God. In fact, that statement from Abraham, I think, is a summary statement of all that the Lord has brought him through. His concluding remark after all of what we have seen in Abraham's life since chapter 12. Abraham finally says, "You are the everlasting God." And so the beginning and the end and everything in between in this chapter is about the greatness of our God who works wonders. In order to see that this morning, we're going to try to make 3 observations from the text this morning, beginning with this one. Because God is who he is, he does what he does. By that I mean to say that because of who God is in terms of the greatness of his character, the excellency of his nature, the power of his being, God does the wonders, performs the miracles that he does. Read with me our text beginning in verse 1 of chapter 21. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. I think you would agree with me that we are a society that struggles tremendously with the need for instant gratification. As a society, I think we are a little bit like that impatient little girl from the first Willy Wonka movie who demands of her father, don't care how, I want it now. I recently finished a book that I really quite enjoyed, which is, it turns out, the first book in a promising series of books. But I was incredibly disappointed to discover when I came to the end of this book that the other books in the series have not been written yet, and in fact, the second book is still in the process of being written. And the first thought that came to my mind was, how dare someone recommend to me a book that is in a series that is not complete yet? Why would somebody do that to me? Clearly, whoever recommended that book to me is a miserable person who enjoys and wants to share their misery. You know who you are. Now I have to wait, and I hate waiting. We are, as a rule, not good at waiting. When Abraham and Sarah first show up in the biblical narrative, he is 75, she is 65. They already in their marriage have waited unsuccessfully for the birth of a child. No children came. The years of childbearing and then child rearing passed them by. Sarah's status as a barren woman is really and truly cemented, even at that point when we first meet them. And then God comes and gives them this unbelievable promise. No, you are still going to have a family. In fact, a great family, a family that's going to grow into a nation that will bless all the other peoples of the earth. And Abraham believed God's promise, as unbelievable as it was, and God counted that faith as righteousness. Well, then the years keep turning, don't they? 5 years goes by, and then a decade, 15 years, then 2 decades. It's now been 25 years since that promise was made. Abraham is no longer a 75-year-old man. He is a 100-year-old man. Sarah is 90. By any human standard, this promise that they have been waiting for has lapsed into default some time ago. Why would you continue to believe, and why would you continue to hope, even hoping against hope, that this promise would ever see fulfillment? Biologically, it was incredibly hard to believe when the promise was made. Now it seems like sheer lunacy to continue to believe it. 100 years old, 90 years old. If it's too good to be true, it probably is, right? We know that the promises of, say, charlatans and snake oil salesmen and con artists and the like are empty and meaningless. And Abraham knows himself very well what it is to be deceitful and manipulative and untruthful, doesn't he? Just the last chapter, he was passing off Sarah as merely his sister, a trick that he had pulled before. Abraham knows what it is to be dishonest and deceitful. He knows what it is to pull the wool over someone else's eyes. So then, have Abraham and Sarah been duped? Have they been lied to and taken in and tricked and deceived? Was this all a joke? And if so, how old will they finally be before they recognize this ruse for what it is? How long will they keep waiting? But then we finally, after all of these chapters, get to this very simple, almost understated verse. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And so we see from the beginning of this chapter that unlike man, God is a truth-telling, promise keeper. There's been so much emphasis on man's scheming and deceiving and manipulating in recent chapters. But in all of these episodes of human conniving, they only show in greater relief the greatness of the God who, because he is who he is, he does what he does. That according to his nature and his character, he does not, and in fact cannot, lie. That he makes promises that in human terms seem unbelievable and unrealistic, and that in human time seem to pass out of all thought and memory, and yet promises that he always keeps and keeps in his own good time. I love the experience of going for a walk the day after a really good rain. The rain has a way of cleansing the dust and the pollen out of the air. And then it also refreshes the plants and the flowers and the greenery such that there's just a vibrance and a vitality and a radiance to the color that just dazzles the eye on a day after a good rain. After looking at a kind of dust-colored world with faded color, the world just looks almost too beautiful to be real after it's experienced a good rain. And that's what God's character looks like in comparison to the dusty and faded and duplicitous character of the people that we've been observing for the last few chapters. Here is one who absolutely keeps his word and who fulfills every promise that he makes. And not only is this holy God set apart in terms of his truthfulness and faithfulness, but he is also a God who delights in working in mysterious ways. Look at verses 2 through 5. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time in which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. Notice in those verses the repeated emphasis on Abraham and Sarah and also their age and the unlikeliness in human terms of them ever having this child. Moses is going out of his way to emphasize that point in these verses. God is sovereign, and in his providence, he could have chosen anyone that he wanted to out of all of humanity to bless, to covenant with, and to make promises to. He had his pick of anyone who he wanted. And he picks an old man, a barren woman, and then he extends the weight of their childlessness an additional 25 years.
Hey, what's up, everybody?
The writer of Hebrews describes Abraham's physical condition at this point when Isaac is born as Abraham was as good as dead. Not exactly a flattering description. You want to be called, you are as good as dead. That's what the writer of Hebrews thinks of Abraham at this point. He was as good as dead. These, in other words, are the least obvious, the least likely, the least plausible pair that you could think of. If they applied to an adoption agency, they would be rejected. You can't parent these children. You've passed the stage of life where this is a reasonable thing for you. So the burning question is why? Why? Why does God choose these two people in this way, in this time, for this plan? And in answering those questions, I'd like to proffer three reasons. First, because in the mystery of choosing the weak and the feeble and the frail things of this world, God reveals beyond all doubt and all question the unsurpassed greatness of who He is. Because of who God is, He does what He does. So when a barren woman at 90 years old, by a man 100 years old, conceives and gives birth to a son, it simply defies all natural explanation. There is no dismissing whose power is at work in the birth of this child. No other option is really plausible. There is no other explanation that will suffice. When people look at this couple, they are going to be forced to reckon with the fact that something miraculous has transpired here. It is in using jars of clay like Abraham and Sarah, and I would submit like you and me, that God's glory shines at its brightest. And when we see the mystery of God's providence working itself out in the wonders that He performs, even in the frailness of men and women like you and me and like Abraham and Sarah, what other response do we have other than to step back and in humility say, Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Majestic in holiness, awesome in deeds, doing wonders, as Moses says in the book of Exodus. Who is like you? Who can do these marvelous things? Show me another God who can do what our God does. Or as the hymnist William Cowper writes, God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. I'm sure in those years of elongated barrenness, Sarah at times felt as though there was a frowning providence of God toward her. And yet what does she discover? That God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform, and that behind such frowning providence, he hides a smiling face so that she can say, the Lord has brought laughter to me. All who look over me will laugh with me. They will rejoice with me. God works in a mysterious way. Why? His wonders to perform. Second, why does God work in these mysterious ways? Well, because in using this old man and this old woman, God reveals with absolute clarity that this is a special child. The covenant that God made with Abraham is not some ordinary covenant. And the promises that God made to Abraham are not ordinary promises either. They are redemption-shaped promises. And this living child from a dead womb, from a man as good as dead, is an emphatic underscoring of the fact that this child is special, and the promises this child is carrying are special promises also. There is, in other words, nothing ordinary to see here. Third, God works in mysterious ways because it requires that we trust his promises by faith, even when we cannot see. It's easy enough to believe in what is likely and what is probable, isn't it? That's not hard. It's just what we expect to happen. But it requires faith to trust God to do what he promises to do when what God promises to do is something miraculous. So the author of Hebrews writes in chapter 11, by faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of the heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. See, those who come to God, those who would follow him and trust in his promises, they are a people who walk by faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. It is what it is to be the people of God, to be a people of faith, which means that you and I are people of faith because we are waiting on the outcome of God's miraculous promises to us. Now, at times we confess that is a mustard seed of faith. At times it is even a faltering faith, as we have seen with Abraham and Sarah. It can be up and down, and yet nonetheless, we come to God by faith. Now, I've noted numerous times that if you or I were in charge of this whole scenario, that we probably would have had it already with Abraham and Sarah. We would have recasted, said, no, the part's going to someone else. You guys are done. We're finding someone else for these promises. You guys have just messed up one too many times. We would have looked at their schemes and plans and deceptions and said, you're done. But not only does God not do that, but see that God brings joy to his people. Verse 6, and Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have bore him a son in his old age. The outcome of all of this waiting and trusting and believing is not simply the fulfillment of God's promise, but in the fulfillment of God's promise is the coming of joy. Sarah holds this newborn child in her arms as she is overcome with the thought that God has made laughter for me. He has given me joy. Who would have thought? I mean, what an appropriate text this is to come to on Mother's Day, isn't it? Sarah is a mom for the first time at 90 years old. Who would have thought that such a thing could be, Sarah says, which is kind of a funny thing to say because God has been telling them over and over again, this is exactly what's going to happen. But what Sarah is saying is, by any human logic, this is an unimaginable thing to happen. Who would ever have written fiction as odd as this reality? Nobody would think up such a thing. It will be a source of incredulity and amazement and wonder and gladness for everybody who hears it. I mean, people love to tell their birth stories. Nobody is going to get one over on Sarah when it comes to the birth story. It's crazy. How many of you over this weekend had the opportunity to see the Northern Lights? So many beautiful pictures on Facebook and just the incredible display of God's power and His creativity. And you just wonder, how can someone go outside, look up into the heavens, see God's handiwork on full display, and say, there is no God? How can you look into the face of God's power and deny His existence? The Apostle Paul in Romans will say that it is only by being given up to a debased mind, the denial and rejection and suppression of truth, that people can get to such a place. But the objective witness of creation is shouting at the top of its voice, how great is God. This child is doing the exact same thing. When people stop to consider this remarkable child, they will be forced to contemplate the work of a God who, unlike man, is a truth-telling, promise-keeping God. A God who works in mysterious ways in order to more brilliantly display His glory. A God whose promises result in joy for His people, even at unexpected times. That this is a God of faithfulness and loyalty and truth and goodness. That this is a God of power and sovereignty. That this is a God whose control over His creation is total and absolute. A God who does what He pleases, when He pleases, to whom He pleases. That must be the objective witness of everyone who comes to look upon this remarkable child. This newborn child in Sarah's arms is a living testament of the fact that because God is who He is, He does what He does. Before we move on, I'd like to just briefly reflect on two principles of application for us. Number one, God can and does use people in their weakness and in their frailty. As a correction to our pride, remember that God does not choose you because of who you are. He chooses you because of who He is and of His commitment to make you more like Him. And beyond just a correction to our pride, that should also be a tremendous source of hope and encouragement to us. And here's why. Abraham and Sarah were not chosen because of what they had to offer God. We've seen how unlikely they were to fulfill this mission and how up and down they are spiritually this whole time. And yet God delights in using the weak things of this world in order to shame the strong. He delights in using what the world considers to be the foolish things in order to show the bankruptcy of the so-called wisdom of the world. So if at many times in life you feel just this crushing sense of your inadequacy to be used by God, to be an ambassador for God, as we are called to be His representative in a world that so desperately needs Him. And let's be honest, who among us can be an ambassador or a witness for God? We feel this crushing sense of inadequacy. If you ever feel that perhaps you are about the last person that God should ever use, and that you have nothing that you could possibly offer, and that therefore you may be excused from ministering to others or sharing the gospel, if you feel that your gifts and talents are just not enough, and you look around and you see those people have clearly been given more, they've been given more talents and gifts and abilities, they've been better equipped for the mission, let them do it, and now sort of step back and just let other people do their part, then recall these words from the Apostle Paul. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. That's the gospel. But we have this treasure, this thing beyond all price. We have this treasure in jars of clay. That's you and me. So that, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Why does God give the transforming power of the gospel, the face of the glory of God in the person of Jesus Christ? Why does he shine that in the light in the hearts of broken, darkness-filled people? It's not because they were so deserving and God desperately needed them on his team in order to accomplish his purpose. It's so that even in these weak jars of clay, God's surpassing glory shines at its brightest. So it's not on the basis of what is in us that God uses us, but it is on the basis of what is in him. Second, we need to learn how to wait, and how to wait on the promises of God. We've noted already that we are an instant gratification kind of people living in an instant gratification kind of culture. We have so many opportunities for fast food. You can order something on Amazon Marketplace and have it delivered to you in the midnight hours so that it's there on your porch step while you were sleeping, which is kind of creepy to think that somebody's delivering packages to you at 3 a.m. in the morning. You can watch whole series of shows on streaming services so that you don't have to wait for seasons to be over. And if you have good friends, you won't have books recommended to you until the whole series is complete. We are an instant gratification kind of people, which means that we are prone to disappointment and even despair when our hopes are delayed, even for a short period of time, because we haven't learned how to wait. Like the proverb says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. It's for this reason that the mockery of people in the last days is going to be so persuasive, the Apostle Peter says. Here's what he writes in his second epistle. This is now the second letter that I am writing to you, beloved. In both of them, I am stirring up your sincere mind by way of a reminder that you should remember the predictions of the holy prophets and the commandment of the Lord and Savior through the apostles. Knowing this, first of all, that's always an indicator what's coming is important. Knowing this, first of all, that scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. They will say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. What is it that Peter says is of incredible importance for believers living in the last days to remember? What is the warning that he needs them to understand? Know this, people are going to come in the last days. They're going to mock the promises of God, and their mockery is going to be based on the premise, where is the fulfillment of the promises? Because haven't you noticed how long it is that you've been waiting? Since the early fathers of the church died, everything has stayed the same. How dopey are you to continue to wait on a promise that is clearly not going to be fulfilled? That's the mockery. And apparently, Peter thinks it's going to be persuasive. Because why? We struggle to wait. In the economy of our time and of our lives, waiting on God's promises can feel so very, very long. And that's even in the best of times. But what happens then when life just gets hard? And suffering comes. And the dark of the night just gets deep and long, and there is no end in sight. What about those times when with the psalmist all we can say is, how long, O Lord, will you forget forever? Abraham and Sarah have been hearing this same promise for 25 years. And at times we see that their faith in that promise almost runs out, and they try to find alternative solutions to fulfill the promise of God. Paul tells us in Romans 4, they hoped against hope because it was so hard because the promise took so long. Well, the church has now been waiting for the consummation of the promises made to us for 2,000 years. But do not grow tempted to doubt the reality of the promise, because know this, there was finally a day when Sarah held a real living and breathing child in her arms. It was not some spiritual, ethereal promise that would never actually be fulfilled. No, one day she held a living, breathing, crying child in her arms. Just as one day there will be a day when Christ comes for us. He is not slow concerning his promise, as some count slowness. He is long-suffering and patient. We are here because of that long-suffering patience of God. And when his redemptive promises are fulfilled, notice, like for Abraham and Sarah, when his promises are fulfilled for us, there too will be great joy and laughter for his people. Because God is who he is, he does what he does, so trust him. Second, sinful choices have lasting consequences, and yet God is merciful. Verse 8, the child grew up and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned, but Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had bore to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." The thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son, but God said to Abraham, "Be not displeased because of the boy, because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. I will make you a nation, and I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning, took bread and a skin of water, and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the region of Beersheba. The text continues, "When the water skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went out and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, and said, 'Let me not look on the death of the child.' And as she sat opposite, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, 'What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation.' And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. As she went, she filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt." You'll, of course, recall back in chapter 16 that Sarah comes up with this plan that she brings to Abraham that, hey, this promise doesn't seem to be getting fulfilled through me. We're going to have to find an alternative strategy. Go sleep with my servant Hagar, have a child with her. Abraham listens, and he does this sinful thing. And we dubbed that at the time the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad plan. And predictably enough, even immediately, that produces strife between Hagar and Sarah. We flash forward now, and little Isaac has been born and is now weaned, which most commentators say suggests that Isaac is somewhere in the vicinity of 2 to 3 years old. And for his weaning, Abraham throws a celebratory feast, but Sarah catches sight of Ishmael, presumably in the context of this celebration, laughing. And again, in the context of the passage, the laughing seems to be somehow at Isaac's expense. There's something there between the sons. And Sarah immediately goes to Abraham and demands that he cast out Hagar and Ishmael so that there will be no disputing in the future who is the rightful heir and legitimate son of Abraham. Now, I think in light of all that has transpired, we may be tempted at this point to look at this and think that Sarah is once again being jealous and greatly overreacting and certainly being harsh about what seems to be an innocent bit of juvenile laughter. She's way blowing things out of proportion. That might be our first inclination, but I think on closer inspection, we actually see something different. I think the Bible actually upholds Sarah's action as a righteous and wise course of action here, and there's a few reasons for this. And first, we need to dismiss from our minds this idea of Ishmael as though he is some small child himself at this point. Back in chapter 17, we read that Abraham circumcised Ishmael when Ishmael was 13 years old. And then shortly after that, these 3 visitors come to Abraham, say, "You're going to have a son about this time next year." That happens, and then a few years after that, we have Isaac being weaned, and that's when this celebration takes place. So we are talking at some level about Ishmael in the vicinity of a 15 to 17-year-old boy at this point, not a little lad of 5 or 6 years old. So let's get that clear in our mind, which means that this significant age disparity highlights the potential vulnerability of this little toddler Isaac at the hands of his older half-brother Ishmael. There is a greater vulnerability here than we might initially think if we don't get those timelines clear in our mind. The second issue that we need to address is what exactly is meant by this laughter in verse 9 that Sarah sees when she sees Ishmael laughing at Isaac. And I think the reason why this word laughing is used is it's a word play against Isaac's own name. Isaac, you remember, means he laughs. Also, Sarah herself has just said in the preceding verses, God has given me laughter. So this is a word play referencing off of that but in a negative way. Whereas Isaac's name and Sarah's laughter are positive blessings from God, this is the negative consequence of Sarah and Abraham's actions. God has given his laughter to them, but their folly has produced a different kind of laughter, a negative kind of laughter. So this term is being set in opposition to the laughter in the preceding verses. This term to laugh has a wide spectrum of potential meanings in Hebrew, which of course it does. All Hebrew words have a wide range of potential meanings. It can mean innocent laughter or to play with, but it can also be used to defer to mockery or derision. It can mean even physical and even sexual interaction or abuse. We see that even in the book of Genesis, this word used to denote that kind of interaction. And in terms of what Sarah sees Ishmael doing in relation to Isaac, the Apostle Paul gives us a little bit greater clarity in his writing to the church at Galatia. He writes in chapter 4, "Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of the promise. But just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh, Ishmael, persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman." Well, what is the context in which Paul is writing there? He is writing to those who are suffering persecution from those who are saying, no, you either will submit to the law and follow the law, or we will persecute you. He's writing to believers who are struggling with not assimilating their grace through faith, belief, and justification with those who are requiring them to submit to the practice of the law under the threat of physical persecution. That's the context in which Paul is writing. And the Apostle Paul is pointing out that Ishmael is the child of the flesh because Ishmael was produced through Abraham and Sarah's scheming and sinful plan. So he is like the child of the flesh. Isaac, in contrast, is the child of the Spirit because he was born by the promise and miraculous intervention of God. And Paul uses these as an analogy to set them in contrast with one another. In context, Paul is arguing that those who willingly place themselves back under the law are like Ishmael. They're born according to the flesh in man's own attempts to find our own means of saving ourselves and bringing about our redemption apart from the promises of God. You want to do that? Well, then look at the outcome of Ishmael. He's thrown off. He is the son of the slave woman. He is banished from the promises. In contrast, those who live by faith are instead like Isaac, who is the child of the promise by the Spirit and who receives the promises. That's who those who are in faith are like. So it's an important analogy that we need to heed whenever we get to our study of the book of Galatians. But for the purpose of our study in the book of Genesis this morning, the relevant factor is, how is Paul using this analogy in relation to persecution? He's saying, just like the child of the flesh persecuted the child of the promise in the past, so it is now. Those who are persecuting you are revealing that they are like Ishmael, not like Isaac. You, however, want to be Isaac's heirs, not Ishmael's heirs, because Isaac was the child of the promise. Well, how does that analogy work? If the persecution, which was real and physical and endangered the lives of the church at Galatia, doesn't in some way reflect the persecution that Paul is reading into Genesis chapter 21. In other words, whatever Sarah sees described in this term laughter is not some innocent boyhood jest at the expense of a younger brother. That is too light a reading on the Apostle Paul's view. It is not an innocent interaction that irrationally triggers Sarah's spite. It is perhaps physical, it is perhaps emotional, it is certainly calculated to disrespect. Whatever it is, Ishmael is persecuting Isaac. And that level of disrespect and ill treatment from Ishmael was enough to warn Sarah. These boys cannot safely grow up together. In fact, Paul treats Sarah's statement as an inspired statement from God, and that seems, in fact, to be supported from our text because God tells Abraham, whatever Sarah says, do. Last time listening to Sarah and her plans produced this whole mess, but this time Sarah's counsel is good and wise. She is acting out of a righteous concern to protect the child of promise. Now, many of you know that when I'm not reading works of theology, I really enjoy reading works of history. I recently finished a biography by Jack Weatherford of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan was the son of a clan leader among his people. But as was common among those days, Genghis' father had multiple wives and multiple children by those multiple wives. Well, Genghis' half-brother was the son of the royal wife, which meant that the half-brother was the one who would eventually ascend to be the tribal leader. But Genghis hated this. He chafed at it all growing up. And so he took every opportunity that he had to regularly disrespect his brother growing up, hoping to kind of offset the political rut that they were in as a way of maybe exceeding his brother and getting the tribal elders to see, no, Genghis would be a better heir apparent. But that didn't work. And so eventually Genghis realized that as long as his half-brother lived, that Genghis would never lead. So one day when he was about 13 years old, Genghis crawled up in the tall grass near a rock where his half-brother was sitting. And when he was an arm's length away, he stood up, confronted his brother, and then before his brother could do anything, he shot his brother through with a bow and arrow and killed him. And thus, Genghis would grow to become the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, one of the bloodiest leaders in the history of the world, even though that had not been his future or his birthright, but something that he took by murderous force, killing his half-brother to take what did not belong to him. And that would seem to be something of Sarah's concern here. She sees, in other words, the opportunity of Cain and Abel repeating itself, a brother jealous of another rising against a brother, and she can see it beginning. Abraham and Sarah's bad plans have resulted in bad blood, and now the threat of bloodshed. And so Sarah goes to Abraham and she says, you have to cast them out. And Abraham is greatly grieved by this because he loves Ishmael. For the last 13 years, at least the first 13 years of Ishmael's life, we know that Abraham thought this would be my heir. He's looked at this child for those formative years as his one and only son, the one who would carry on the promises. He loves this son. And it's here once again that we find that our sinful choices have lasting consequences. If Abraham and Sarah had just waited on the Lord and trusted in his promises, then there wouldn't be this threat of violence against the son of promise, nor would there need to throw away this beloved child or to cast him out, to banish him. There wouldn't be any need for this if they had just trusted in the Lord. They thought that they were solving a problem for God. In reality, they were creating one. Then, of course, Hagar and Ishmael have contributed to this whole sin. Hagar by treating Sarah with contempt, Ishmael for treating Isaac, who is the child of promise, with malice. What Hagar should have done is to cling to Abraham and Sarah, to respect them and say, like Ruth will later, your people are my people, your God is my God, where you go, I will go. Why? Because Abraham, all the promises of God are to and through and for you. God has said, whoever blesses you, I will bless. Whoever curses you, I will curse. Therefore, I want to be with you. She doesn't do that. She stirs up animosity with Sarah, just as Ishmael could have done what Jonathan will later do when he finds out that the kingdom is not going to go to him through his father Saul, but is instead going to go to David. What happens? Well, rather than hate David, Jonathan loves David. Why? Because David is the Lord's anointed one. Or Ishmael could have done what David will later do when he has the opportunity to kill Saul, and David says, how could I have raised my hand against the Lord's anointed? That's what Ishmael should have done, but what does he do instead? He torments the child of promise. Rather than in rejoicing in what God is doing, Ishmael rejects this promised child. So Abraham and Sarah started this whole mess. Now Hagar and Ishmael are perpetuating it, and it's tearing Abraham's heart apart. And yet, in the midst of all of this ugliness, all of this mess created by human sin, God is gracious and merciful, isn't he? He says to Abraham in verse 13, I will protect and provide for Ishmael. I will still make him a nation for your sake. God doesn't simply step back and say to everyone, you know what? You've made your bed. Sleep in it. You've made your mess. Figure it out. You've dug yourself into this hole. Good luck getting out. That's not what he does. He intervenes in mercy. And so Abraham sends off his son Ishmael and Hagar into this wilderness. And just when things are looking dark and Hagar is despairing because there's no water and the boy is dying, God sends his angel to bring Hagar and the boy to a well of water. And then in verse 20, and God was with the boy. He grew up, he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took for him a wife from the land of Egypt. Unfortunately, this will not be the end of the consequence of Abraham and Sarah's action. This will have cascading effects for Isaac and for Ishmael and for their children down through the generations. We would do well to remember that there was always a price to pay for our sin. Sooner or later, the bill always comes due, and sometimes it will even have generational consequences. In the moment, we get lulled into thinking that sin is offering us a way out or a way forward or is offering us what we really want or need. But it is always, in reality, lying and deceiving us into relationship-destroying suffering. And yet, even when the consequences of our actions have come to wreak havoc in our lives, we find when we turn to God that His mercies are still new and fresh every morning. Like we so often sing, what patience would wait as we constantly roam? What Father so tender is calling us home? He welcomes the weakest, the vilest, the poor. Our sins, they are many, but His mercy is more. Third and finally, God will make His name great through His people, or even at times in spite of His people. From God's mercy on Hagar and Ishmael, there is a sudden scene change at the end of the chapter back to Abraham, in which we are reacquainted with Abimelech. Verse 22, and at that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore, swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity, but as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me, and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. Imagine being Abimelech here for just a moment. This guy Abraham shows up in your country. He tells you that this woman who he's with is just his sister. You take her into your harem, and then God comes to you by night and says, do not touch her. She's another man's wife. If you don't return her to her husband immediately, you're a dead man. Then on top of that, the whole time that this woman Sarah is in your household, all of the other women in your city can't conceive children. And then you return this woman, a little time goes by, and then you get word that this woman, at 90 years old, with a man that you now know as her husband, who is 100 years old, you're getting a birth announcement. Your neighbors have just had a baby. They're having a baby shower. What's going on? What on earth is going on here? This has to be what Abimelech is thinking. Now he knows, right, that Abraham is not a trustworthy character. So he is not coming on the strength of Abraham's character to make a deal. Notice how often he says, please don't deal treacherous with me. Deal with me as I have done with you. And by the way, I need you to swear by your God. And notice what motivates all of this. God is with you in all that you do. Now, this is in spite of the fact that Abraham's behavior and conduct, and as we saw last week, even his way of speaking about God, has not made God's name great through anything Abraham himself has done. Abraham deceives, he manipulates. When confronted, he blame shifts, he self-justifies. We even saw he even speaks of God in a way that is accommodated to the pagan idolatrous beliefs of the Philistines when he refers to God in the plural. The gods, they caused me to wander. He doesn't even speak truthfully of the one true God. In other words, Abraham is not being a faithful ambassador when we see him in chapter 20. But notice this. Despite how poor of an ambassador Abraham has been, God has vindicated His own name. He has made His own name great in front of these pagan people. The king of the Philistines, if he knows anything, knows for absolute certain that the God he is dealing with is the real deal, and that this God is apparently in covenant with Abraham. which is the only reason that this king wants to be in covenant with Abraham. There's nothing about Abraham that makes you say, that's a trustworthy partner I want to be with. The only thing that this pagan king wants is peace with God. And the way to peace with God, he believes, is through peace with Abraham. That's why he comes. God is making his own name great among the nations through and even in spite of his people. So they barter back and forth. The people of God exist for the everlasting fame of God. But we can know this: even when we fail to make God's name great, God will make his own name great on the earth. So they barter back and forth for a little while. They dispute over a well. We're not going to focus on that because this theme is actually going to reappear in a few short chapters. But they enter into a treaty with one another. Abimelech then heads back with this new peace treaty with Abraham tucked in his pocket. And then we read down in verse 33, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. And I think these verses are sort of the capstone of Abraham's experience up to this point that serve as the bridge into the chapter that's coming. In light of everything that Abraham has seen and experienced about who God is, Abraham has nothing else that he can do other than to stop and to worship. What is the only right response when we see the greatness of the promise-keeping, truth-telling, mercy-giving God? It's worship. We must call on the name of the Lord and worship the everlasting God. Friends, why is our heart so often devoted to scheming and planning? Why do we doubt the truthfulness of God's promises? Why do at so many times in our lives we feel ashamed to stand on what God has said is true and right and good? Why do we seek our hope and our joy and our satisfaction in sinful places and pleasures? Why do we find it so hard to trust in God when the night is dark? And why do we have such worry and fear for the future and for these times that we live in? I think it is for this reason. Our view of God is simply too small. Abraham needed to have an enlarged and expanded view of the greatness of God in order to be ready for the great trial that is about to come in the next chapter. And now, in the face of all that he has seen and all that he has learned and experienced of God's greatness and faithfulness and mercy and kindness and goodness, Abraham calls on the name of the everlasting God and worships. You cannot have a transformed life and a low view of God. So if we would be changed, if you would have a heart and life that is free from doubt and worry and fear, then we must have our vision of God expanded and heightened and deepened and widened. To know that God is from everlasting to everlasting, that he is good, that he is true, and that he keeps every promise every time. And then our souls must rise in worship to say, behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Let's pray. Father, we have spent now these many weeks and chapters with Abraham and Sarah, following these promises and these renewed promises and these renewed promises, all bound up in this coming of a child. And we can look at Abraham and Sarah and we can see that at times their faith stumbles, at times it falters. And we can be so quick to look upon them and to jump on them and say, how could you fail yet again? And yet we look in our own lives and we see how many times we also suffer from doubt and perplexity and despair. And we take courage from the fact that, as the author of Hebrews tells us, that even in times as we see this stumbling and bumbling, yet Abraham and Sarah persevered in faith, and that you vindicated their faith in your power and your goodness and your character by being true to your promises. So God, help us to see the greatness of who you are. Help us to have a vision for you that is heightened and deepened. May we be transformed as we gazed upon the glory that is revealed to us in the face of Jesus Christ. In his name we ask it. Amen.